My parents gave my sister $150K and called me a failure. So I cut them off. 2 years later, my name is Maria Dawson. I'm 31 years old, from Colorado Springs. The lie I told myself for 29 years was that my family loved me. They just didn't know how to show it. It was a comfortable lie. It fit neatly over the empty spaces at dinner tables and the silence on the other end of the phone. It was a soft blanket I used to cover the cold truth. I was a ghost in my own home. Ghosts don't get seen. They just watch. The night the lie finally died, the air smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary. It was a Sunday, the kind of evening my mother orchestrated to look like a painting of a perfect family. The dining room table was dark, polished wood, reflecting the warm light from the chandelier above. The plates were our best china, the ones with the tiny gold rims that we only used for holidays or special announcements. I knew, even before we sat down, that this dinner was not for me. It never was. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, drop a comment, where are you watching from? My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table. He was a man built of sharp angles and quiet disapproval. He ran a successful consulting firm, and he valued two things above all else: results and appearances. My sister, Olivia, was his greatest result. I was his failed experiment. My mother, Eleanor, sat opposite him, a perfect hostess with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her job was to keep the painting perfect, to smooth over any cracks before they could show. She was an expert at pretending not to see things, especially my feelings. And then there was Olivia, my younger sister. She was 2 years younger, but in our family's story, she was the sun. Golden hair, a laugh that sounded like music, and an effortless charm that made people want to give her the world. She sat beside me, her knee occasionally brushing against mine, a small, unconscious gesture that felt more like an accident than a connection. She was glowing. She'd just gotten engaged to a man my father approved of, a junior partner at a law firm, and they were looking for a house. I was there because it was expected. I was the older sister, the quiet engineer who lived in a small apartment downtown and wore sensible clothes. My life was a neat, orderly line graph of small, steady achievements. A promotion at my firm, a successful project launch, paying off my student loans 5 years early. These were things I was proud of, but in my family, they were met with a polite nod before the conversation inevitably turned back to Olivia. We made it through the salad. Dad talked about the stock market. Mom asked Olivia about wedding venues. I pushed lettuce around my plate and answered yes or no when spoken to. The main course arrived. Mom carved the chicken with practiced ease. The clinking of forks against china was the only sound for a few minutes. Then Mom put her fork down. She looked at Olivia, and her smile finally, genuinely, reached her eyes. "We have something for you, honey," she said, her voice soft with pride. She reached under her chair and pulled out a simple white envelope. It was thick. She slid it across the polished table. It stopped right in front of Olivia's plate. Olivia's eyes widened. "Mom? Dad? What is this?" "It's a housewarming gift," Dad said, his voice uncharacteristically warm. "For our successful daughter." Olivia picked it up. Her hands, with their perfectly manicured nails, trembled slightly as she opened the flap. She pulled out a check. Her breath hitched. I didn't need to see the number to feel its weight in the room. It was heavy enough to suck all the air out. $150,000, Olivia whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mom said, reaching across to squeeze her hand. "We are just so proud of the life you are building." The room was filled with their happiness. It was a thick, sweet fog, and I was choking on it. I looked at my plate, at the cooling slice of chicken, and felt nothing. Not jealousy, not even anger, not yet. Just a profound, hollow emptiness. This was their story. I was just a background character, an extra hired to fill a chair. Then my father turned his gaze to me. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by the familiar, weary disappointment. It was a look I had seen 1,000 times. A look that said, "Why can't you be more like her?" "You see, Maria?" he said, his voice flat and cold. It cut through the warm fog like a shard of ice. "This is what success looks like." He gestured with his fork toward Olivia, who was now crying happy tears while Mom hugged her. "You're 31, he continued, his voice lowering into a lecture. "Living in a rented apartment? Working a dead-end job with machines? You have nothing to show for your life. You're the failure, Maria. We invest in winners. We invest in winners." The words hung in the air. The clinking of silverware stopped. Olivia's happy tears froze on her cheeks. Even my mother looked away, her gaze falling to the centerpiece of lilies on the table, suddenly fascinated by a petal. No one defended me. No one said he was wrong. Their silence was his applause. Something inside me didn't break. It clicked. A lock I had been carrying for years, a heavy, rusted thing, finally clicked open. The hurt was gone. The desperate need for their approval, the ache of being invisible, it all just vanished. In its place was a quiet, cold clarity. I carefully placed my fork and knife together on my plate. I picked up my cloth napkin, folded it neatly, and set it on the table. My movements were slow, deliberate. I could feel their eyes on me. They were waiting for the tears, for the shouting match, for the familiar drama of the disappointing daughter. I gave them nothing. I stood up. My chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor. I looked directly at my father. My voice was steady. It didn't tremble. It didn't rise. Then invest in her, I said quietly. I'll build myself. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I didn't run. I didn't storm out. I walked down the familiar hallway, past the gallery of framed photos on the wall. Olivia at her prom. Olivia on her graduation day. Olivia on a beach, laughing. There was one of me, from when I was 10, holding a spelling bee trophy, tucked away behind a much larger photo of the whole family on vacation. A vacation I had missed for a summer engineering camp. I reached the front door, my hand closing around the cool brass knob. Behind me I could hear the murmur of voices, the celebration starting up again, the brief interruption already forgotten. They were moving on. The painting was being restored. I stepped out into the crisp Colorado night. The air was cold and clean and it filled my lungs. I didn't look back. I just closed the door softly behind me. That night, while they celebrated my sister's success, I walked out of their perfect house for the last time. What they didn't know was that I wasn't leaving defeated. I was leaving free. I was leaving to start something they'd never see coming. I was leaving to build a life where I didn't need their investment. The blueprint for that final dinner was drawn long ago, in the quiet, carpeted rooms of my childhood. Our house was beautiful. A 2-story colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn, but it was also a museum of my failures and Olivia's triumphs. Her trophies glittered on the mantelpiece. My report cards were filed away in a drawer. Her ballet recital photos lined the hallway. My science fair projects were relegated to the garage before being thrown away. I was 12 when I learned my worth wasn't measured in effort or intelligence. It was measured in shine. That was the year I poured everything I had into the state science fair. For 3 months, my bedroom floor was a mess of wires, wooden dowels, and straws. I was building a model of a suspension bridge. I spent hours in the library, reading books on structural engineering that were meant for college students. I loved the logic of it, the way math and physics came together to create something strong and beautiful out of simple parts. It felt like magic I could control. My bridge was my masterpiece. It was intricate and precise, and when the judges placed a full, heavy textbook on its deck, it held strong. It didn't even tremble. I won first place. The ceremony was held in a huge, echoey gymnasium. When they called my name, my heart pounded against my ribs. I walked onto the stage, the bright lights making me squint. The metal they placed around my neck was heavy and cool against my skin. It was gold and gleaming. I looked out at the sea of faces, the proud parents with their cameras flashing, and I searched for my own. I scanned the 2 seats they had promised to be in, right in the front row. They were empty. A cold, familiar knot formed in my stomach. I knew where they were. They were in Denver, a 2-hour drive away. They were in a different auditorium, one filled with sequins and hairspray, cheering for Olivia as she competed in a beauty pageant. She didn't win. She got a participation ribbon. When I got home that night, my grandfather, who had driven me, squeezed my shoulder before he left. "You did a wonderful thing, Maria," he'd said. He was the only one who ever seemed to see the world I was building. I walked into the kitchen, the metal still around my neck. Mom and Dad were already home. Olivia was sitting at the table, pouting about her loss, while Mom gently brushed a tangle out of her elaborate hairdo. I took off my medal and placed it on the kitchen counter. It made a soft metallic sound. "I won," I said, my voice small in the big room. Dad glanced at it once, a brief, dismissive flick of his eyes. "Strange girl," he muttered, more to himself than to me. He shook his head as he opened the refrigerator. "What kind of daughter plays with machines?" Mom didn't say anything. She didn't look at the medal. She didn't look at me. She just kept fixing Olivia's hair, her focus absolute. "Your sister's a star," she said, her voice a soothing balm meant only for Olivia's bruised ego. "You were the prettiest one there, honey." I stood there for a long moment watching them. The gold medal on the counter felt foolish, like a toy I had brought to a grown-up party. I picked it up, the weight of it no longer feeling like pride but like shame. I took it to my room and put it in a shoebox at the back of my closet. That was the rhythm of my childhood. Silence for me, applause for her. My achievements were strange. Hers were celebrated. It wasn't that Olivia was cruel. She was just a planet, and my parents were her willing moons caught in her orbit. She absorbed their attention so completely that there was none left for me. If she scraped her knee, it was a family crisis. If I got an A on a calculus exam, it was an expectation met. Nothing more. We'd sit at the dinner table and I would try to talk about a book I was reading or a project I was working on, and my father's eyes would glaze over. Then Olivia would mention a new dress she wanted, and suddenly the whole family was engaged in a lively debate about colors and styles. I learned to be quiet. I learned to be self-sufficient. I did my own homework. I fixed my own broken toys. I learned to cook for myself when they were late coming home from one of Olivia's dance practices. I retreated into my world of books and diagrams, a world that made sense, a world where effort equaled result. That world was my safe harbor. I remember one Christmas when I was 14. I had saved my allowance for months to buy my dad a vintage book about architectural design I'd found in a used bookstore. I wrapped it perfectly. Olivia bought him a tie from the mall. When he opened my gift, he flipped through the pages, a flicker of something, maybe interest, maybe just surprise, in his eyes. "Thank you, Maria," he said, and for a second I felt a surge of hope. Then he opened Olivia's. He held up the silk tie. "Now this is a great gift, Liv," he boomed. "Practical, stylish, you have excellent taste." He wore that tie to work the next day. The book was left on a side table and eventually disappeared onto a dusty shelf, unread. My mother was the enforcer of this silent hierarchy. She never said a cruel word to me, but her actions spoke volumes. She was the one who signed Olivia up for everything. Ballet, pageants, voice lessons. When I asked to join a robotics club, she sighed. "Oh, Maria, that's for boys. Why don't you try something nicer?" When I insisted, she relented, but she never came to a single competition. She was too busy, she'd say. Too busy being the mother of a star. I wasn't a star. I was a black hole. I was the quiet, dense thing in the corner of the family portrait that pulled light in and gave none back. They didn't understand me, and because they didn't understand me, they decided there was nothing there worth seeing. It was easier to look at the bright, shining thing right in front of them. It was easier to invest in a winner. The pattern that was set in childhood hardened into concrete as I grew up. Leaving for college was like coming up for air after being held underwater. For the first time, I was in a place where my last name didn't mean Olivia's sister. I was just Maria. My professors saw my mind, not my strange hobbies. My friends saw my loyalty, not my quietness. I majored in civil engineering and I thrived. In the world of physics and formulas, there was no favoritism. There was only truth. A bridge either stands or it falls. The numbers don't lie. I loved it. I loved the feeling of solving a problem, of creating something tangible and useful. I graduated with honors and was hired by a top engineering firm in Denver right out of school. I found a small apartment I could afford on my own, filled it with secondhand furniture and lots of books. And for the first time, I felt like I was building a life that was truly mine. But the gravitational pull of my family was strong. I kept trying. I thought, maybe if I'm an adult, if I'm successful on my own terms, they will finally see me. I would call home every Sunday, a ritual of quiet hope and predictable disappointment. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" "Oh, we're fine, honey. Your sister just had the most amazing weekend. She went to a vineyard with some friends, and you won't believe who she met." The conversations were always a bridge to Olivia. I was just the on-ramp. I remember the day I got my first big promotion. I was 26, the youngest project lead in my division. I had worked tirelessly for it, staying late, taking on extra work, proving myself over and over. I was so proud I felt like I could burst. My hands were shaking when I dialed my dad's number. I wanted him to be the first to know. "Dad, I have some incredible news," I said, my voice buzzing with excitement. "I got the promotion. I'm a project lead now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I heard the rustle of a newspaper. "Oh," he said. His voice was flat. "That's nice." Another pause. "Listen, I've got to run, but before I go, your sister just closed on her first house. A beautiful little place in a great neighborhood. We're so proud of her. She really knows how to make smart decisions." The line went dead. I stood in my office, the phone still pressed to my ear, and the buzzing excitement inside me fizzled out, leaving a cold, heavy silence. Smart decisions, as if my career, my financial independence, my entire life was just a series of foolish choices. The message was clear. Her life was real life. My life was just a hobby. Still, I kept showing up. I drove to Colorado Springs for every birthday, every holiday. I would sit at the table, a smiling ghost, and listened to the endless stories about Olivia, her new boyfriend, her new car, her promotion in a marketing job I didn't fully understand but knew was considered more impressive than my own. Each visit was like pressing on a bruise. It hurt, but I did it anyway, hoping that one day the skin would have toughened, that it wouldn't hurt anymore. I pretended their indifference didn't sting. I brought thoughtful gifts that were met with polite, distracted thank yous. For my mom's 50th birthday, I spent a month creating a detailed family tree, doing research online, and even calling distant relatives. I had it professionally printed and framed. Olivia gave her a designer handbag. The handbag went on her arm the next day. The family tree was leaned against a wall in the study where it gathered dust. Every interaction became a scorecard I never asked to play on. My rented apartment versus her new house. My practical Toyota versus her stylish convertible. My quiet, steady career versus her more glamorous social one. They weren't just cheering for her. They were actively betting against me. My choices were framed as mistakes. My independence as a failure to launch properly. The pain was a low, constant hum in the background of my life. It was always there. But over the years, that hum began to change its frequency. It became less like hurt and more like a warning signal. It was telling me something was wrong with the foundation. That night at the dinner, when they handed Olivia the check for $150,000 and my father called me a failure, the hum stopped. The warning signal went silent. It stopped being hurt because hurt implies a hope that things could be different. The hope was gone. All that was left was clarity. They didn't see my value because they never wanted to. They weren't blind. They were just looking in the other direction. My entire life had been an audition for a role I was never going to get, a role that had already been cast. I had been trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I had none, and as I stood up from that table, a strange sense of peace washed over me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was just done. Done trying. Done hoping. Done pretending that their love was something I could earn if I just worked hard enough. You can't earn something that isn't on offer. So I decided to stop proving it to them. I decided to start proving it to myself. Clarity is a cold comfort when your world falls apart. For a few weeks after that dinner, my newfound freedom felt like a victory. I went to work, came home to my quiet apartment, and felt a strange lightness. The Sunday phone calls stopped. The pressure to show up for holidays vanished. The silence I had always dreaded was suddenly a relief. It was a space I could finally fill with my own thoughts, my own plans. Then, 3 months after I walked out of my parents' house for the last time, I lost my job. It wasn't personal. The company was downsizing, a major project had lost its funding, and my division was hit the hardest. My boss called me into his office on a Tuesday morning. He looked genuinely sorry. He said all the right things. Last one in, first one out. It's not about your performance. We'll give you a glowing recommendation. The words floated around my head but didn't sink in. I walked out of the building into the biting Colorado cold, clutching a severance letter and a cardboard box with a desk plant and a few engineering textbooks. The sky was a flat, unforgiving gray. I had no backup plan. I had no family to call. The safety net I thought I had built for myself, my career, my independence, had just been ripped out from under me. I drove home in a daze. My apartment, once my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was deafening. It was the sound of being utterly, terrifyingly alone. For the first time, the weight of my decision to cut off my family crashed down on me. I had chosen this. I had chosen to have no one. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened my laptop and, against my better judgment, I looked at our old family group chat. I hadn't deleted it, just muted it. It was like a relic from a past life. The last few messages were a flurry of exclamation points and heart emojis from a few weeks prior. And then I saw it. A new photo, posted just an hour ago. It was a picture of my sister Olivia standing in front of her new house. She was holding a bottle of champagne, a wide, triumphant smile on her face. Beside her, our parents were beaming, their arms wrapped around her. They looked happier than I had ever seen them. The house behind them was beautiful, a modern craftsman with a big front porch and professional landscaping. The caption, posted by my mom, read, "So proud of our successful daughter, celebrating the first night in her new home. Family is everything. Family is everything." The words felt like a physical blow. They hadn't called me. They hadn't texted. In the 3 months since I had walked out, not one of them had reached out to see if I was okay. They hadn't even noticed I was gone. Or if they had, they didn't care. I was not part of their everything. I was nothing. I stared at the screen, at their smiling faces, and something inside me finally, truly shattered. It was the last, most fragile piece of hope I didn't even know I was still holding on to. The secret, childish belief that if something bad happened to me, they would come. They would rescue me. They weren't coming. They were celebrating. My fingers moved across the keyboard before I could think. My hands were shaking, but my mind was calm. I typed one final message into the chat. A message for all of them. A message for myself. Thank you for teaching me to stand on my own, even in the cruelest way. I hit send. I watched the little delivered notification pop up. I didn't wait for a reply. I clicked on the group settings, my cursor hovering over the words Leave Group. I clicked it. Then I went to my contacts. I found my mother's name. Block. My father's name. Block. My sister's name. Block. It was done. The final ties were cut. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of my apartment. The silence was different now. It wasn't peaceful, and it wasn't deafening. It was a void. A vast, empty space where a family used to be. The next few weeks were a gray, featureless blur. I sent out resumes. I got rejection emails. I made coffee that grew cold on the counter. The severance money was running out faster than I'd expected. Rent was due. I'd lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, the weight of my failure pressing down on me. Maybe my father was right. Maybe I was the failure. I had no job, no family, no future. I had hit the absolute bottom. I didn't know it yet. But that's the thing about hitting bottom. There's nowhere else to go but up. And that silence, that terrifying void I had created, it would become my power. It was the clean slate I never would have been brave enough to ask for. It was the foundation on which I would finally, truly, build myself. The gray blur of unemployment continued for weeks. Each day was the same as the last. Wake up, search for jobs online, receive polite rejections, and watch my bank account shrink. The Colorado winter had settled in, covering the city in a thick blanket of snow and a deeper layer of gloom. I started taking long walks just to feel something other than the four walls of my apartment closing in on me. One afternoon, the snow was coming down in thick, wet flakes. I ducked into a tiny cafe on a side street downtown, mostly to escape the cold and the feeling of hopelessness that was sticking to me like the snow on my coat. The place was called The Daily Grind. It was old and worn, but it had a warmth that had nothing to do with the heater rattling in the corner. The air smelled of coffee beans and old books. I ordered a black coffee I couldn't really afford and sat at a small table by the window, watching the snow fall. The owner, an older man with a kind, wrinkled face and hands stained with what looked like paint, was wiping down the espresso machine. He kept glancing over at me. I tried to ignore him, assuming I looked as miserable as I felt. After a few minutes, he brought a small plate with a cookie on it over to my table. "On the house," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "You look like you could use it." "Thank you," I mumbled, surprised. He squinted at me, his head tilted. "You look familiar. You're Maria Dawson, right? The engineer." I was so startled that I just nodded weakly. My name was on a few local news articles from a year ago for a bridge restoration project I had led. I didn't think anyone would remember that. "Used to be," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I was laid off." He nodded slowly, wiping his hands on his apron. He looked around his little cafe, at the flickering fluorescent light, the peeling paint on the wall, the section of the counter that was propped up with a stack of books. "Well, a used to be is better than a never was," he said with a small smile. "My name's Art. This place, it's falling apart. The wiring is a mess, the plumbing is a joke, and the whole place needs a facelift. I was quoted $5,000 by a contractor I can't afford. I've got $1,000 left in my savings to fix it. That's it." He looked me straight in the eye. His gaze was sincere without a hint of pity. "Interested?" he asked. I stared at him. $1,000. It wasn't enough to pay my rent, not really. It wasn't a career. It was a handyman job. My pride, what little I had left of it, bristled. I was a civil engineer who used to manage multi-million-dollar projects. Now I was being offered $1,000 to fix a coffee shop. But then I looked at Art's hopeful face, and I looked around the tired old cafe. I saw the faulty wiring not as a mess, but as a puzzle. I saw the sagging counter not as a problem, but as a challenge. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something inside me. It wasn't excitement, not yet. It was purpose. "Yes," I said, my voice clearer than it had been in weeks. "I'm interested." For the next 3 weeks, that cafe became my world. I showed up every morning before the sun rose. Art would have a hot coffee waiting for me. He paid me $200 up front so I could buy groceries, and trusted me with the rest. I started with the wiring, tracing the old faulty lines and replacing them. I replumbed the sink behind the counter, I tore out the sagging bar and, using scrap wood Art had salvaged from a neighbor's renovation, I built a new one. I sanded it until it was smooth as glass and stained it a deep, warm walnut. I repainted the walls a soft, creamy white that made the little space feel bigger and brighter. I fixed the rattling heater. I built new shelves for the bags of coffee beans. I worked with my hands in a way I hadn't since I was a kid, building that model bridge in my bedroom. The physical labor was grounding. The act of making something broken whole again felt like therapy. Every day I could see my progress. Every fixed wire, every fresh coat of paint was a small victory. It wasn't a blueprint on a computer screen. It was real, tangible change. Art would sit at a table, watching me work, telling me stories about his life. He was a retired art teacher who had sunk his pension into this cafe. He saw it as his last great project. He never once questioned my methods. He just trusted me. That trust was a bigger payment than any amount of money. When we were finally finished, we stood in the doorway together. The cafe was transformed. It was clean, bright, and welcoming. The new bar glowed under the warm lights I had installed. The place looked brand new, but it still had its old soul. Art's eyes were shining. He put a hand on my shoulder. "You've got magic in your hands, kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Real magic. I felt a swell of pride that was purer than any promotion I had ever received. I hadn't just fixed his cafe. I had started to fix myself. A week later, a writer for a local alternative magazine who was a regular at the cafe did a small feature on its renovation. He took a photo of the new interior and wrote a little piece about it. Abandoned cafe restored by local engineer. He mentioned my name. The day the magazine came out, my phone, which had been silent for months, started to buzz. Then it buzzed again. And again. I checked my email and my jaw dropped. My inbox, once filled only with rejection letters, was suddenly flooded. They were from small business owners, from people with old houses that needed love, from community centers with tiny budgets. The messages all said some version of the same thing. "I saw what you did with the daily grind. I can't afford a big firm, but I have a project. Can you help?" I sat on my couch, my laptop open, and for the first time since that horrible dinner, I cried. But they weren't tears of sadness or failure. They were tears of overwhelming, unexpected hope. My father had told me my work with machines was worthless. My family had invested in what was shiny and new. But here, in the real world, people needed what I could do. They needed someone who could see the value in what was broken and find a way to make it strong again. My inbox was a chorus of small, desperate hopes. A bookstore owner whose historic shelves were sagging under the weight of too many stories. A young family whose century-old farmhouse leaked cold air through every seam. A community garden that needed a sturdy, functional shed built from donated materials. These were not glamorous jobs. They were not the kind of projects that would get my name in an architecture magazine. They were small, broken things that people loved, and they were reaching out to me, a stranger, to help them. I didn't have a company. I didn't have a business license or a fancy website. All I had was a sketchbook, my old set of tools, and a grid I was just beginning to realize I possessed. I started by saying yes to the bookstore. It was run by a woman named Sarah, whose passion for books was so infectious you could feel it in the dusty air of her shop. She could only pay me a few $100s, but she also offered me unlimited coffee and a lifetime discount. For a week, I worked in the quiet hush of her store. I learned to love the smell of aging paper and ink. I carefully unloaded every book from the old, warped pine shelves. Then I took the shelves apart, plank by plank. I reinforced them with hidden steel brackets and reassembled them, sanding away decades of grime until the pale wood shone again. When I was done, the shelves stood straight and strong, ready to hold another generation of stories. Sarah cried when she saw them. She wrapped her arms around me in a fierce hug. "You didn't just fix my shelves," she whispered. "You saved this place." That feeling, that quiet, profound satisfaction, became my new currency. It was worth more than any paycheck my old firm had ever given me. One by one, I took on the projects that felt right. I weather-sealed the old farmhouse, showing the young couple how to caulk windows and add insulation. They paid me with a check and a home-cooked meal that tasted like gratitude. I spent a weekend designing and building the garden shed, using mismatched lumber and salvaged windows. The gardeners paid me with a box of fresh vegetables every week for the rest of the summer. My life found a new rhythm. It wasn't about climbing a corporate ladder. It was about laying a foundation, one good deed at a time. I was no longer an engineer in an office tower, disconnected from the real-world impact of my work. I was Maria, the woman who could fix things. I was building a reputation, not on a resume, but in the hearts of the people I helped. I was poor, I was often tired, but I had never felt richer. My small apartment began to feel less like a cage and more like a home base, a place to rest and sketch out the next solution. One of my jobs came from an ad I saw on a community bulletin board. It was a simple, handwritten note. Need help repairing an old cabin. Must be willing to travel. Fair pay. There was a phone number at the bottom. The idea of leaving the city, of working in the mountains, appealed to me. I called the number. The job was in a quiet, remote mountain town a few hours west of Denver. The cabin belonged to an elderly couple who had inherited it and wanted to make it livable for their grandchildren. When I arrived, the air was thin and crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. The cabin was nestled in a grove of aspens, looking tired but proud. Its bones were good, but its skin was worn. That's where I met Ethan. He was the couple's nephew, a structural engineer who had offered to oversee the project for free. When I pulled up in my beat-up Toyota, he was on the roof, checking the integrity of the beams. He moved with a quiet confidence, a stillness that seemed to fit the mountain landscape perfectly. He was tall and lean, with kind eyes that seemed to notice everything. "You're Maria?" he asked, climbing down the ladder. His voice was calm and low. "I am," I said, shaking his outstretched hand. His grip was firm, his hands calloused like mine. For the next 2 weeks, we worked together. Our days started with the sunrise, the mountain fog still clinging to the valley below. We'd share cheap coffee from a thermos, sitting on the porch steps, and talk through the plan for the day. He worked like silence was sacred. We didn't need to fill the air with meaningless chatter. We communicated through the work itself. I'd hold a board steady, and he'd know exactly where to drill. He'd hand me a tool before I even had to ask for it. He respected my knowledge in a way no one in my family ever had. He'd watch me sketch a solution for a leaky window frame or a sagging floorboard, and he'd nod, a small smile on his face. "That's smart," he'd say. "That'll work." Coming from him, a man who understood the language of stress loads and support structures as well as I did, those simple words felt like the highest praise. We replaced rotten porch planks, reglazed old windows, and patched the stone chimney. We ate lunch sitting on a fallen log, looking out at the vast expanse of the Rockies. He told me he'd left a big firm in Chicago a few years back, tired of designing concrete parking garages. He wanted to build things that mattered, things with a soul. I told him about my own layoff, about the small jobs I'd been doing. I didn't tell him about my family. I didn't have to. He seemed to understand that I was also looking for something with a soul. On our last day, the cabin was transformed. It was safe, warm, and sturdy, ready for a new family to fill it with laughter. We stood on the new porch, watching the sun dip below the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The work was done. "You're a natural at this," he said, looking at the cabin. But I knew he was talking about more than just the repairs. "You don't just fix things. You bring them back to life." "I had a good partner," I replied. A comfortable silence fell between us. I felt a pang of sadness that this was over, that I'd have to go back to my solitary life in the city. He turned to me then, his expression serious. "You ever thought about building something that's entirely yours?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, not just fixing other people's things," he said, his eyes searching mine, "but starting from scratch. A piece of land, a design, something that is born from your own 2 hands, something that's just for you." I didn't have an answer. The idea was so big, so audacious that I couldn't even wrap my mind around it. My entire life had been about fitting into spaces other people had defined for me. My parents' expectations, my company's job description. The thought of creating my own space, a place that didn't exist until I willed it to, was both terrifying and thrilling. I just shook my head, a small, uncertain gesture, but the question didn't go away. It followed me back to Denver. It rooted itself deep inside me, a tiny seed planted in the quiet, fertile ground of my new life. It was a question that would eventually change everything. The seed Ethan had planted lay dormant for 2 months. I went back to my life of small projects, finding satisfaction in every repaired fence and repainted room. But his question echoed in the quiet moments, late at night, while sketching designs, or on long drives between jobs. Building something that's entirely yours. It felt like a dare, a life I wasn't sure I was brave enough to claim. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, with an Oregon area code. "Maria?" The voice was familiar and calm. "It was Ethan." "Ethan. Hi, how are you?" I asked, surprised and a little flustered. "I'm good. Listen, this is going to sound crazy," he said, and I could hear the wind on his end of the line. "But remember what I asked you? About building something for yourself?" I remember, I said, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I think I found the place, he said. I'm in Oregon. I took a trip up the coast, and I found a piece of land. It's near the ocean. You can hear the waves. It's mostly trees, Douglas firs and pines. The owner is old and wants to sell it fast, so it's cheap. Dirt cheap? 5 acres. He paused, and I held my breath. It's a big risk, he continued, his voice steady. But I can't stop thinking about it, and I can't imagine doing it with anyone else. So I'm asking, you in? My mind raced. Oregon? I had never even been to Oregon. I had a life here. A small, fragile life, but one I had built myself. I had clients who depended on me. I had an apartment. It was insane. It was irresponsible. I had a little money saved, but not nearly enough for such a gamble. Every practical bone in my body screamed no. It was too much, too soon. But my heart, the part of me that had been dormant for so long, whispered a single powerful word, yes. It was the whisper of the 12-year-old girl who built a bridge from straws. It was the whisper of the woman who walked out of her family's home with nothing but her own integrity. This wasn't just about building a house. It was about answering the question he had asked me on that porch. It was about building a life that was entirely mine. Yes, I said, the word coming out stronger than I expected. I'm in. 2 weeks later, I had packed my entire life into my old Toyota. I sold what wouldn't fit, gave notice on my apartment, and said goodbye to the clients who had become my friends. I drove west, across the vast empty plains and over the towering mountains, towards an ocean I had only ever seen in pictures. The land was even more beautiful than Ethan had described. It was a wild, untamed piece of the world. The air was thick with the scent of salt and pine. Giant ferns grew in the underbrush, and a small creek cut through the property on its way to the sea, which was a sliver of deep blue visible through the trees. We named it Evergreen. It felt right. It felt like a promise. We pooled our savings and bought it outright. We were landowners. We were also completely broke. For the first month, we lived in a tent, clearing a small patch of the land by hand. We drew up plans at a makeshift table made from a tree stump and a piece of plywood. We designed a small cabin, just 600 square feet. It was all we could afford to build. We wanted it to be self-sufficient, a quiet rebellion against a world of excess. We designed it to be solar-powered, with a system for collecting rainwater. The main room would be all windows facing the ocean. It was a simple design, but it was ours. Then the building began. That year was the hardest and most beautiful year of my life. We learned the true meaning of labor. We dug the foundation ourselves with shovels until our hands were blistered and raw. We mixed and poured the concrete for the footings. We learned how to frame a wall, how to raise it into place, feeling the weight of our future home in our own muscles. There were days when the Oregon rain was relentless, turning the building site into a sea of mud. We'd work for hours, soaked to the bone, our fingers numb with cold. There were days when we made mistakes, a board cut too short, a measurement that was off by an inch, and we'd have to undo hours of work. In those moments, frustration could have easily turned into anger, but it never did. We learned to laugh at the mistakes, to see them as part of the process. We were a team, in the deepest sense of the word. Ethan was my steady rock. When I was exhausted and ready to give up, he'd make a pot of coffee and sit with me, and we'd just watch the trees until my resolve returned, and I was his. When he was struggling to solve a complex structural problem, I would sit with him and sketch out ideas until we found a solution together. Our partnership wasn't built on grand romantic gestures. It was built on sweat, sawdust, and a shared, silent understanding. It was built on the thousands of small moments that make up a life, handing him a hammer, sharing a sandwich, watching a sunset from the half-finished frame of our home. Slowly, painstakingly, the cabin took shape. It rose from the earth like another one of the trees, a natural extension of the landscape. Every single piece of it told a story. The main support beam was from a massive fir that had fallen in a storm a few years back. The stones for the small hearth we found in the creek bed. We laid every floorboard, hammered every nail, and installed every window ourselves. When it was finally done, nearly a year after we had first set foot on the land, it felt less like a building and more like a living thing. It glowed in the afternoon light, the cedar siding warm and golden. It had a heartbeat of its own, a rhythm that matched the waves crashing on the shore in the distance. I walked through it, running my hand along the smooth wooden walls. This was real. I had done this. I had built a home, not just a structure of wood and nails, but a place of safety, of peace, of belonging, a place where my worth was not up for debate. It was in every perfect joint, every level floor, every window that looked out onto a future I had made for myself. That evening, I took a photo with my phone. It wasn't a professional shot. It was just a simple picture of the cabin at sunset, nestled in the trees, a thin curl of smoke rising from its new chimney. I posted it on my old, mostly dormant social media page. I didn't add a long story. I didn't mention my family or my past. I just wrote one simple sentence as the caption, "Built this myself." I turned off my phone and went inside, where Ethan had a fire going in the hearth. We sat together in the quiet, watching the flames, feeling the profound, bone-deep satisfaction of having created something beautiful out of nothing but a dream and our own two hands. I didn't know it then, but that one quiet photo, that one simple sentence, was about to send a ripple out into the world that would bring my past crashing into my present. By morning, it had gone viral. 2 years passed. 2 years of quiet sunrises, of the smell of salt and wood smoke, of a peace so deep and steady it felt like it had seeped into my bones. Life at Evergreen was simple. Ethan and I had started a small design and build company, specializing in small, sustainable structures like our own. The viral photo had brought us a wave of clients who wanted what we had, not just a house, but a home with a soul. We were busy, but it was a good kind of busy. It was the work of creation, not of obligation. Our life was a quiet, happy rhythm, punctuated by the sound of saws, the chatter of birds, and the distant roar of the ocean. My past felt like a story I had read about someone else. The anger had faded, leaving behind only a faint silvery scar. I no longer thought about my parents or my sister. They were ghosts from a life that no longer belonged to me. I had built a new world, and in this world, I was not invisible. I was the architect. One sunny afternoon, I was outside, kneeling in the small lavender garden I had planted near the porch. The air was warm, and the scent of the lavender was calming. I was trimming the dead blooms, my hands covered in dirt, completely lost in the simple, repetitive task. That's when I heard it. A sound so alien to our quiet world that it felt like a violation. The high-pitched screech of tires on gravel. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans, and looked toward the long driveway that wound through the trees. A silver BMW, the kind of car that belonged in a high-end city suburb, not on a dirt road in the Oregon woods, skidded to a stop by our simple wooden gate. The car looked panicked, its sleek, metallic body a stark contrast to the wild green of the forest. The driver's side door swung open, and a woman stumbled out. Even from a distance, I knew who it was. Olivia. But it was an Olivia I had never seen before. Her perfect blonde curls were a mess, undone and tangled. Her expensive clothes were rumpled. As she got closer, I could see that her face was pale and blotchy. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks from crying. She was yelling into her phone, her voice sharp and frantic. "I don't care what he said, you have to come here now," she screamed into the phone. "Dad, just get here. It's her! I found her!" She snapped her phone shut and shoved it into her purse. Then she saw me. She froze, her mouth slightly open. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, darted from my face to the cabin behind me. She took in the solar panels on the roof, the wisp of smoke from the chimney, the handmade porch swing, the vast, breathtaking view of the Pacific Ocean behind it all. Her gaze was a frantic inventory of a life she couldn't comprehend. "Maria," she whispered, her voice trembling. You live here?" I nodded slowly, staying where I was, my feet planted firmly in the soil of my garden. "I built it," I said, my voice even. It wasn't a boast. It was a simple statement of fact. She took a shaky step forward, then another. "But how?" she stammered. "They said you ran off. Mom said you had some kind of breakdown. Dad said, he said you failed." The word hung in the air between us. Failed. The word that had defined me in their world for so long. Hearing it now, in this place I had built with my own hands, it sounded absurd. It had no power here. A small, sad smile touched my lips. "Guess they were wrong," I said softly. Olivia just stared, her carefully constructed world visibly crumbling. The sister she knew was the quiet one, the strange one, the one who was always in the background, the failure. She wasn't prepared for this version of me, calm, grounded, and surrounded by a life that was more beautiful and more real than anything their money had ever bought. Her lower lip began to tremble. The anger and panic drained out of her, leaving behind a raw, painful vulnerability I had never seen in her before. "He left me," she whispered, the words tumbling out. "Mark left. He said the house was a money pit. The market crashed. Dad's investments. It's all gone, Maria. The money, the house, everything." She looked around wildly, as if searching for something to hold on to. "I have nothing," she said, her voice cracking. "I did everything they wanted. I was the perfect daughter, I was the winner, and I have nothing. A single tear rolled down her cheek, tracing the path of the smeared mascara. I don't even know who I am anymore. I looked at my sister, my beautiful golden sister, the sun around which my family had always revolved, and for the first time, I didn't feel a lifetime of resentment. I felt a wave of pity. She had been a victim too, just a different kind. I was the ghost, but she was the puppet. They had pulled her strings for so long that she didn't know how to stand on her own. I walked over to her, and for the first time in our adult lives, I felt a genuine connection to her pain. I didn't offer a hug. It would have been a lie. Instead, I offered her the only truth that had saved me. Then start finding out, I said, my voice gentle but firm. Start finding out who you are. Without them, just as the words left my lips, another sound broke the silence. The low rumble of a larger engine. A big, black SUV, the kind my father always drove, was making its way up the gravel driveway. They were coming. The past was no longer at my gate. It was about to be on my doorstep. The black SUV crunched to a halt behind Olivia's BMW. It looked like a hearse in the middle of all this life. The doors opened and my parents climbed out. They seemed smaller than I remembered, diminished by the scale of the towering fir trees and the open sky. My father, Richard, got out first. He was wearing a golf shirt and slacks, clothes meant for a country club, not the rugged coast of Oregon. His face was a mask of anger, but I could see the fear flickering in his eyes. It was the fear of a man who has lost control. My mother, Eleanor, followed him. She looked pale and frail, her hand clutching her pearls as if they were a talisman that could protect her from this unfamiliar world. She avoided my gaze, her eyes darting around at the cabin, the garden, the wildness of it all, as if she couldn't process what she was seeing. Dad stormed towards me, his jaw tight. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the cabin with a critical, dismissive air. He was trying to find a flaw, a crack in the foundation of my new life. "Where did you get the money for this?" he demanded. There was no greeting, no "how are you?" Just the same old question, the only metric he understood. He assumed I must have tricked someone, or that a man had paid for it all. The idea that I could have created this myself was simply not in his vocabulary. "Work," I said evenly. My voice didn't shake. I stood my ground, my feet still planted in the soft earth of my garden. The kind of work you never thought was good enough. My mother finally looked at me, her eyes filled with a confusing mix of regret and self-pity. "Maria, please," she said, her voice cracking. "We were so worried. We only wanted what's best for you." That old, tired excuse. The lie they told themselves to justify their cruelty. The lie I had believed for so long. Not anymore. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. "You didn't want what was best for me. You wanted what looked best for you. You wanted a daughter you could show off at dinner parties. You wanted Olivia. You never wanted me?" I saw a flicker of pain in her eyes. Maybe a part of her knew it was true, but she quickly buried it, retreating to her role as the victim. "That's not fair," she began to whisper. "Fair?" I interrupted, and for the first time, a spark of the old hurt ignited within me, hot and clean. "Was it fair when you left an empty chair at my science fair to go to her beauty pageant? Was it fair when you called me a failure for choosing a career I loved? Was it fair when you handed her my inheritance and told me you only invest in winners?" I took a step towards them. They both flinched. "You didn't invest in a winner," I said, my voice dropping. "You created a dependent. You built her a beautiful cage, and when the money ran out, the cage fell apart. And you crippled her so badly she doesn't even know how to fly." I glanced at Olivia, who was watching us, her face a canvas of dawning, horrified understanding. Just then, the cabin door opened. Ethan stepped out onto the porch. He didn't say a word. He just came and stood beside me, wiping his hands on a rag. His presence was calm, steady, and absolute. He put a hand on the small of my back, a simple, supportive gesture that said everything. "I am here. We are a team." My father's eyes flicked between Ethan and me, his mind clearly racing, trying to fit Ethan into his narrow worldview. He saw a strong, capable man, and his expression shifted. He thought he finally understood. "Ah," he said with a sneer. "I see. He built all this for you. Is that what this is all about? Did you build all this for revenge? To try and throw it in our faces?" It was his last-ditch effort to make it all about him, to believe that he still held that much power over me, that my life was still a reaction to his judgment. A genuine smile touched my lips. It was a faint, sad smile of pity for this small man who couldn't see beyond his own ego. "No, Dad," I said, and his name felt foreign on my tongue. "I didn't build this for revenge." I paused, letting the words settle in the quiet, pine-scented air. I looked from his angry, frightened face to the strong, peaceful home we had built. I looked at Ethan, my partner, the family I had chosen, and I gave him the final clean truth. Revenge means I still care what you think. I held his gaze. I don't. For the first time in my entire life, my father went silent. Utterly, completely silent. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a slack-jawed, hollow look of shock. It was the look of a king who had just realized his decrees meant nothing, that his kingdom was a barren rock, and that his subjects had long since sailed away to build a new world of their own. He had no words. He had no power here. The foundation of his world had been his ability to judge me, and I had just taken that away from him. He just stood there, speechless, as the Oregon wind rustled the leaves of the trees around us. The reckoning was over. There was no shouting, no final dramatic fight. There was only a profound and deafening silence. His silence, not mine. A week later, a letter arrived. It was in a plain white envelope, tucked into our roadside mailbox. There was no return address, but I recognized the shaky, unfamiliar handwriting instantly. It was my father's. His hand, so used to signing checks and contracts with a confident flourish, looked weak and uncertain. I took it inside and sat at the simple wooden table Ethan and I had built. For a long moment, I just held it, feeling the weight of it. I wasn't afraid of what was inside. I wasn't angry. I was just curious. Inside there were two things. The first was a photograph, a real estate listing printed from a computer. It was a picture of their house, the house I grew up in. A large "for sale" sign was planted in the middle of the perfectly manicured lawn. Seeing it didn't stir any emotion in me. It was just a building, a museum of a life that was no longer mine. The second thing was a single sheet of paper with a few lines scrawled on it. The note said, "Maria, we sold the house. We're moving into something smaller. Your mother and I are talking, for the first time in a long time. Olivia is in therapy. She's trying. We loved you in the wrong way. We're trying to change. And for the first time, Maria, we're proud of you." I read the words over and over. They were clumsy and simple, but they were the truest words he had ever written to me. We loved you in the wrong way. It was an admission, an apology, an ending. I didn't cry. The part of me that had once craved those words had healed over. Hearing them now was like receiving a package you ordered years ago and had long since forgotten about. You appreciate the gesture, but you don't need the contents anymore. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Then I stepped outside into the soft Oregon wind. The air was cool and clean. I walked over to a spot near the porch with a clear view of the ocean. Earlier that week, Ethan and I had bought a small sapling from a local nursery, a young Pacific dogwood. I had been waiting for the right moment to plant it. This was the moment. I dug a hole in the rich, dark earth, my hands connecting with the soil that was now my home. I gently placed the sapling into the ground, its fragile roots reaching down into their new foundation. I packed the soil around it, giving it a new start, a place to grow, strong and free. A new tree for every silent year I had survived, and for every year of peace to come. As I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees, Ethan came up beside me. He slipped a strong, comforting arm around my shoulders, and we stood there together, looking at the tiny tree. "Are you finally happy?" he asked quietly, his eyes on my face. I looked at our cabin, glowing in the late afternoon sunset. I looked at the vast, peaceful ocean stretching out to the horizon. I thought of the noise of my old life, and the beautiful, powerful silence of my new one. "For the first time," I said, and my voice was full and clear. "Completely. They gave my sister $150,000 to build a life. They gave me silence, but silence became my foundation. And on it I built a world.